Thanks for being here. Obviously, we're all very emotional, tired, but we're going to gather all that into our last session together. We're going to have a Q&A, chance for you to put some of your more personal questions to our panel, and I think I will now introduce the panel, so it's not just me weirdly sitting on stage. I think I'll invite them all on at once. Ros Boydell. Where is she? She's in the toilet. Okay, we'll save Ros till last. Darren Jackson, everyone. I feel like I should do a sort of catwalk sort of summary of Darren, but she's in the bathroom, she's coming. Duncan Miller. This is a weird thing, isn't it? Beth Woodward. You can take a seat, Beth. No Ros just yet, that's okay. I would love you each to, you can use the handheld mic. If you could just introduce yourselves, who you are, and perhaps just a bit about why you're on this panel. Yeah, that should be you.
I'm here because I was asked very last minute yesterday, and I felt I had no real choice other than to say yes, because Ros is such a winning personality. Come on, Ros. Like what? What do you want?
Why are you on the panel?
Why? So, purely because I was asked, but I suppose I do. I work as a psychotherapist 1 day a week when I'm not working for the Navigators. I've been doing that for 5 years now. So, yeah. Why are you here?
Why am I here? Similarly, I've studied counselling. I've helped people over the years, and I've been helping myself over the years because it's been a live issue for me too. So that's why I'm here.
Hello. I work as an assistant psychologist with the forensic mental health team. So I work with people that are at quite an extreme end of mental health and just generally like lots of questions around morality and human behaviour. So I might have a bit of a unique perspective. And also, when I was at uni, I really struggled with my own mental health, and I'm really familiar with being in a place of just not really being able to function very well at all, and not really wanting to be alive. So I'd like to share from my own experience as well.
Sorry, what was the question?
Why are you on the panel?
I actually think that these Q&A sessions are sometimes the most significant part of a weekend, because you can really get down to the nuts and bolts of what this looks like, and people have the opportunity to sort of, flesh out what they're going to take from this weekend into everyday life. It becomes less conceptual and more something they can touch and feel. So I'm really excited about this time that we've got to have some proper time to ask questions and play around with some different ideas about how to answer those questions. That's why I'm here.
Thanks very much. Hold on to the mic. So thanks to those who sent in questions. You probably can still text them in. I might get it, might not. We've got a few questions to get on with, so we'll begin with those. Here's one. Thinking about perspective of a lot of us as navigators and not medical professionals. Or just Christians, I guess, and not medical professionals. How can we support a friend with mental illness and know our limits? What are the dangers to avoid, do you think? Beth? What, Beth?
Me? You want to ask me?
Sorry, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Well, I am both a professional, I think, and a navigator. And I've been involved quite intensely with supporting people in my navigator's friend role, probably more than my professional role. I can share some things I've learnt. I think ultimately what people need is a friend, And even as a professional, like, we've got some really important things to offer in that capacity, but none of it really means anything if those people don't have people in their lives that love them and will stick by them as they're working through it. And practically, I think that looks like just like sticking by them and showing them that your love for them extends beyond their perhaps difficult behaviours or their scary things that they're thinking or feeling, and just showing them that you see them as a person for a lot more than their illness and what that turns them into sometimes. And I think in terms of you and your limits, it's really important for you to know what place you are supporting them from. I've been in situations where I have got really involved with people and done really powerful things for them. I think God's really used me, but it's come from a place of wanting to be their hero, and wanting to, like, in a good way, wanting to help them, but also that can turn into wanting to fix them, and maybe like not being okay with them where they are. And I think you have to really check your own motives, and just keep letting go of control over them and their fate, and continuing to be present and rest in God in that. I don't know if that's helpful.
Just to add to what Bethan said, if you find that you're the only person supporting your friend, then you should start asking some questions, because that's a warning light. The professionals talk about support networks, and if the support network is you, it's not a network, and you're never going to be able to take on all that they need on your own. Sometimes we can want to. Bethan's talked about, being a hero for them, but we can't, and God doesn't want us to. And sometimes that means actively taking steps to encourage them to include other people who know who can help. So yeah, that would be my advice. Don't be the only one.
I just want to, Darren, did you have anything?
Sure. I think there's a big difference between like having responsibility for people and responsibility to people. And so I have a responsibility to individuals, but I'm not responsible for their life. And you can get caught in a position where you feel you are the one who has to crack everything. And so you end up making commitments you can't keep to, and you get increasingly isolated yourself. And that's kind of just an extension of what Duncan is saying. Like, when you find yourself in that place where you're constantly stressed and constantly anxious, that it's starting to affect your own mental health. And that is okay to an extent, but where we get into that place where we have a total responsibility for someone else's life, we were never designed to be those types of people. And that's where we have to look for external help. And be aware of your own capacity. Like, knackering ourselves out, trying to help others, in the long run, does not help anyone. And that means having boundaries. People don't like boundaries when it comes to other people, because it feels selfish, and we don't like being selfish. But ultimately, we get so wrapped up in helping another, it actually can become about us. And so we need boundaries for both parties, I think.
Thank you. How can I best help friends whose mental health means that they keep trying to push me away? Roz?
That's a really tricky question, because relational dynamics are really complicated, aren't they? And we're actually human beings, so we are affected by people, even if we're trying to love them. I think the sort of diagram that I quite like using, I can't do it though with the microphone, maybe you could hold this for me, Bethan. So it's like there's two people in any relationship, and we're standing up straight. And sometimes people will try and pull stuff out of us that we don't want, and we'll find ourselves doing things that we don't really want to be doing. We're sort of leaning over towards them. Do you see that? And the challenge in those sort of situations is, what does it look like for me to stand up straight when this person is trying to pull something out of me that I don't want? And then equally, what does it look like for me in the face of them pushing something towards me or pulling away, not to withdraw from them because they're not giving me what I want? The sort of challenge for us as Christians to keep on standing up straight in these relationships and asking God what it looks like to love somebody well, even if it is disappointing, but the sort of steady consistency of being, not giving in to every single request that they ask, but also not withdrawing or avoiding them because they're being difficult relationally. I think that's a real challenge. I think there are ways that we can communicate that we're still with somebody, even if we sense that they're withdrawing from us. And that can just be as simple as the odd text message here or there so that they know that they're not completely alone. So if they're avoiding us completely and don't want to see us, there's still ways we can communicate in a way that doesn't sort of violate their distance, I guess.
Anybody else want to take that one?
Just to carry on from what Ross was saying about don't withdraw, we can do an all or nothing approach. We can say to our friends, I want to give you this kind of help, be quite prescriptive. And if they don't want that kind of help, we're like, well, I'm out of here. And there's a middle ground in between that. There's just being prepared to be with them, even if they don't want any further help than that. That base level can make a massive difference. So we don't have to go in with our ideas of what they want, and neither do we withdraw completely.
This is quite a difficult question here, but how do we put together the excellent teaching this weekend with the fact that there are many Christians struggling with severe long-term mental illness? I don't know. I mean, maybe Ross is...
So the question is, how do you marry together the sort of Christian biblical worldview of God inviting us to this spacious place with the reality of suffering? I guess that's the question, is it? And that's a massive question. How can a God who is good allow people to struggle with really, really difficult things? And for those really, really difficult things not to be sorted out or fixed in a way that these people hope for? And that's a really big question. But I guess it comes down to that question of, do you trust that God is good? And we didn't look at Romans 8:28 yesterday, but that's a verse that's often sort of used as a sticking plaster. Romans 8:28 is the verse that says, "For we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose." That's sometimes used as a sticking plaster that Christians say, oh, it's okay, even though this looks like a really bad thing, God's going to use it for good. But actually that verse is an incredible verse because it's calling us to trust that God is good and that he's able to bring goodness out of stuff that we just think is rubbish and stays on being rubbish every single day. So I don't think there's any easy answer to that, Joe, or to whoever asked the question, because the reality is that for some of us in this room, we're going to face things in our life that are continually going to make us ask that question. Can I trust that God is good and that in allowing me to experience whatever I'm experiencing in life, he's actually communicating his love and goodness to me in a way that my mind cannot fathom? Yeah.
I guess it's worth as well just acknowledging that we live in a world that we're not designed for, and this world isn't as it should be, and there is a lot of tension between who we are now and where we are going, and what we came from, I mean, if it's helpful, from my experience of mental health, I've been in a place where things are really horrible and I'm really suffering, and I have asked that question of God, and I've said, why am I so terrified to leave my bed? Why do I not want to? How am I meant to live a fulfilling life from this place? And kind of directed like bitterness and anger. And I'm not saying this person's asking this question out of bitterness, but I think sometimes we have a tendency to slip into that, and I did. And I think as Christians, we have a really unique position where anything that we experience in life, we can use as a springboard to God and to kind of direct us into relationship with God. And for me, there were things that felt insurmountable that I learnt to learn things from. So with my anxiety, I was always terrified of what was about to happen. And I came to realize that it was a reminder that I was just totally out of control, which is really freeing. And I am not meant to be in control, and the world would be a terrible place if I was in control. And that's been massive on my journey with anxiety. And now every time, like I was a bit anxious to lead the seminars or to be on stage here, and I just learning to be like, oh God, thank you that you are in control. and that you promise that you want the best for me, and that doesn't always look like what I want it to look like. And I guess all of that is to say that being in relationship with God means that you can pull richness and goodness out of things that the world can't. And that, for me, brings something to the experience that people that don't know God don't necessarily have access to.
I think one of the challenges is in a lot of church cultures I've been around, there's like one extreme where it's a very fatalistic approach to God. This is the way the world is and he's sovereign, so just get on with it. And then there's the other extreme of anything bad God needs to come in and get rid of. And if he doesn't get rid of it, then that's a sign of a lack of faith or a lack of trust, or, I don't know, the Holy Spirit isn't here, or that type of language. And in the middle is, if we're talking about the emotional complexity of us, that God has his own, if God is the creator of emotions, he has his own emotional spectrum, and we don't actually allow a space for us to be present with God in suffering. And so the conclusion is always, how do we get rid of this thing? And it becomes about sin management and focal points on behavior, and actually we never engage with the fact that throughout the entire testimony of Jesus' life, he went through a whole range of emotions himself, and that maybe he wants to meet us in that place. And I've found that sometimes the church is the worst place to have that actually encouraged, because I need to present that I'm fine. And for me, it was a real struggle going through my counseling training and realizing I actually had loads of old sadness from my past that I just never dealt with, and I was hiding with Christian activity. And when it started to come out, the advice I was given was, how do we get rid of this? How do we pray this away? How do we stop you being sad? Now, that was often coming from a good place, but actually never allowed me space to engage with Jesus. Mourned over the death of people, so I guess God can be sad with my sadness. And so the way we frame how we engage suffering with the teaching is often the cultures we find ourselves in, and having space to allow one another to be present with God in the midst of that.
Thanks very much. Really interesting question here. How do we know that dealing with our mental health issues with God, as we've learned about sort of this weekend, isn't just another self-help mechanism? There's so many courses and beliefs that seem to help people, other than things that go together with Christianity, like CBT. Most people answer this by saying, they say it helps them, but they don't want to admit they're still missing something. But to be honest, I find that quite an easy answer. Why are we so sure that what we believe is actually true?
Yeah, I think for me the question is whether it gets to the root or not. Is it a sticking plaster over the symptoms, or does it get to the cause? I found the root gets down to needing a source, an unconditional source of worth. I can't get any deeper than that. That seems to be the root of it. And to be honest, I just haven't found any other unconditional source of worth other than God. Not in a way that's always going to be there, not in a way that is always perfect. And I've looked around, and things like CBT are excellent, and they're very good coping mechanisms, and can give you the space and help you get to a place where you can go deeper and go looking for the root cause. But it doesn't get to the root cause on its own. And as I've looked at other models of counselling, that seems to be the case. They can be really, really useful to help stabilise you, but they don't go to the root cause, to our need of love and worth, and getting that unconditionally, because getting that unconditionally is stressful. It causes us psychological stress. God's the one who doesn't. So I've just found it unique. If you found other things, you're welcome to come and tell me afterwards. I'll be very interested.
Sorry.
Oh.
You go.
We can all talk.
Thanks, Dan. I think as well, there can be a temptation to kind of split these things off into boxes and be like, well, I've tried CBT and I've tried this, and maybe I'll try Jesus and that might help. And like this isn't like an alternative therapy. And and also, there's nothing wrong with like self-help or anything like that. I think my perspective is that it's all integrated, and God is in everything. And my journey with therapy and Jesus is that things in the secular world work because they give us a flavour of the things that we find in Jesus. So, for example, CBT talks a lot about rewiring your thoughts. So a certain situation might make you feel a certain way because you think a certain thing about it. And so by challenging those thoughts, you can change the way you feel and behave, which in practice is a lot like my biblical knowledge is going to be shown up here. But the verse in Romans that talks about being renewed by the transformation of your mind. And I think of my journey with God as like the underlying narrative of my life and the way the universe works. And all the things like therapy are just different ways of like accessing that. So like I've been having therapy recently, and one thing that I was learning was to like have self-compassion when I'm feeling like anxious thoughts, if I'm worried about going into a certain situation with people, and I think that they're not going to like me, or that I need to win them over, and just learning to talk to myself in like a compassionate way and being like, actually, Bethan, you don't need to win anyone over, and kind of coming into it from a place of stillness. And I found myself asking this question, like, kind of like finding myself compartmentalizing and being like, well, surely I'm just like brainwashing myself, and maybe I'm taking this on myself and like trying to fix myself, and not, how do I welcome God into that? And another verse, which I will not remember the reference to, is like, whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And I just realized that actually, if I was living in a world that wasn't fallen, my automatic posture towards myself would be the same posture that God has towards me, which is one of love and one of peace. And so I wouldn't have to be retraining myself to think in a way that assumes that I am loved. And therefore, when I train myself to be compassionate, I'm bringing myself back in line with God's original design for me. And so I think you have to catch yourself thinking about these things as separate, because God is in everything.
Can we just clarify what CBT is?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So it's cognitive behavioral therapy. It's like if you went to the doctors for depression or anxiety, it's probably the therapy that you'd be offered.
We were talking. I think we were talking about this in my seminar. I can't remember if we were. You all should have come and you'd have known. But I think the language of self-esteem, I think, is our culture's best attempt to try and acknowledge that there's something not right going on in the heart of most of mankind. And so we found this technique to try and measure and promote something good. But it's kind of, my interactions with a lot of self-help and self-esteem things are that they do have like a temporary goodness to them, but it's always about let's get away from this thing that we're finding difficult. Whereas Christian teaching often takes you into that thing to find out what is going on. Now, therapy does that as well, of course it does. But as Duncan was alluding to, so I trained as a person-centered therapist, and its core theory is that if humans have enough love, non-judgment, and congruence, that's honesty, they will thrive. But the conclusion is, and you need to look to yourself to give yourself those things. And I don't know how to do that a lot of the time. I can get some of that from myself, or then I need to look to others. But I'm affirming a culture of everybody who's doing that. We're all looking into self to try and then somehow build a community out of that. And inherently it doesn't work, and it always falls down in any of the theory when you try to then add other people to the mix. Whereas Jesus as an external source of complete non-judgment, complete honesty, and complete love bypasses all that. But not bypasses as in sweeps away, but kind of comes into the midst of it. And I think that you see that in things like mindfulness, which is very popular. We were doing mindfulness in our seminar. But again, mindfulness is like, it can be helpful because it's about creating space in the mind. But you have to return to life. You have to go back to your life. So it gives you a temporary reprieve, which is very good. Whereas I believe Christian mindfulness is in that space. You bring something in. You bring a truth in that allows you and equips you to return to a life as opposed to just, I have a bit of space, which is good. You need that sometimes to then give yourself a bit of perspective. But if the perspective is, again, self, we can just end up with a new form of the exact same issue.
Rose, did you have a thought on this one about self-help?
Well, just to sort of end this conversation about Christianity, because essentially it's like, are we saying Christianity is a crutch just to make us feel better? And like there's something, I mean, undeniably it's wonderful to be connected in relationship to the source of all life, but don't be under any illusions that what you're called to, if you're going to follow Jesus, is going to be an easy ride in life. Like we're called to pick up our cross and follow him. And to learn how to love people and love ourselves as Jesus does is costly. It's flipping hardcore. This is not the easy route that we've chosen by following Jesus, which is why, I mean, I'm totally up for it. But let's not be naive and think, yeah, this is like an easy life in life, an easy ride in life, just to make me feel better about myself. And you know, we can come to these things and make each other feel good. Not at all. This is where the rubber hits the road in terms of like self-sacrifice and love. It's beautiful.
I have a question actually about I just wonder how you guys feel in terms of how is the church. We've talked a lot about theory and practice. How do you think the church is actually doing at the kind of the positive vision that we're talking about? Do you see the church? We've talked about a kind of growing awareness of the church engaging with mental health. To what extent is that the case? Where is this church still struggling, do you think? Just want to have any thoughts on that. Yeah, just how do you think the church is doing it, what we're talking about?
Well, I don't know what you guys have sort of picked up on, but it seems like there's an increasing awareness that these issues are issues that need to be on the table when it comes to living well as the church. And that can be in our local church context or in the church as we are gathered here today. And so I think there's definitely been a sort of a sea change, certainly since I was at university, where the church is much more accommodating or not so afraid, I think, of issues of mental health or low mood, which is encouraging. But I think in everything, as human beings, our tendency is to look for solutions and quick fixes. And I think there's always a danger that the church does that as well. And I don't know, I think one of the cautions moving forward is that we allow people to be to have the space to really be themselves without trying to make cookie cutter Christians where we all look the same, but also calling people to something that's greater, having a vision that's so beautiful that people are like, yeah, I want my life to be shaped by that. And that's a big question for the church to address anyway. Are we really calling people, or are we just a club for Christians to hang out and have coffee in? But that's a whole other question about what the church is.
Duncan, do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm encouraged that grace is such a focus in the church we're in today. If you look back through church history, it's really had its ups and downs. It's quite amazing it's survived as a concept at all through some periods of history. So yeah, I'm encouraged to live in the time that we do where that's the case, because it's unique, because yeah, God's amazing in that respect.
I echo Rose's thoughts that the church, we're getting there, and we're starting to pick up on it. But I also would like to acknowledge that we're not there, and my experience was really quite negative of the church, and I, at my worst, was interacted with in such a way that I developed a really negative understanding of how God viewed me in my mental illness. And I want to share that for anyone in the room who is in a place where they don't feel like there is room for their mental illness, and the like room to work out their spiritual life. I think, as Duncan said, just that idea of grace. We have to be really cautious to see how people reflect God and see how they don't reflect God. And we can experience God's love through them. But sometimes they act in ways that aren't reflective of God's posture towards you, which is one of acceptance and compassion, and where you are not feeling that you may be being let down, and there is a call for grace from you for that. But it's good to acknowledge that we're not there. We're getting there, but we're not quite there.
Sorry. The question here is, someone says, I'm currently undergoing therapy for anxiety and OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and I often find it very easy to shut God out of this aspect of my life. I've never prayed that God would take away my anxiety and often feel afraid of doing this. Particularly, I'm actually afraid of what would happen if I was okay. Would I be safe? How can I start to bring God into this area and trust him more in the process? I think that question would apply to anyone who's seeking healing in any part of their life. Who wants to?
I guess I alluded a bit to this earlier. Anxiety and OCD were two of the labels I was assigned. Also, I experienced depression as well, but and those were helpful things to kind of categorize my feelings and behaviors under. I think my experience of both anxiety and OCD is that they're really about control. And anxiety, for me, this might not be prescriptive for everyone, but for me it was about always thinking through the possible terrible things that could happen next and how I could prevent them from happening, or how I could prepare myself for how to act when those things happen. And those are really insidious in all of our ways of thinking, actually, but can get to the point where you're thinking of the most ridiculous things. So, like, mine was really wrapped up in my health, and I'd be like, what if I get on that bus and I've got to be on it for an hour, and like 5 minutes in I get really unwell and I like come down with a tummy bug, and what am I going to do if I'm like being really sick? And they were like, people are going to think I'm so gross and I'm just going to be left on my own, I just couldn't even get on a bus because of this ridiculous scenario that I'd made up in my head. And as I got to know myself in that, I mean, as I was saying earlier, I read a book on fear, and it said something about how we can use our fear as a springboard to God. And I don't necessarily want to repeat myself, but I just learnt to recognize my absolute dependence and how releasing it is to recognize that you don't have control and you can't have control. And that is terrifying, but it does come down to trust. And I don't think God expects you to just walk off into the wilderness in the unknown and be totally fine with that. But I think he's there calling you to rest in him. And it's about relationship and walking with him in that. And he's right beside you. I was talking to somebody earlier who was struggling a little bit. I think sometimes we are so busy in our minds trying to manage everything and try and think of all the things that we can do to make sure life works out okay. And God is like standing as our father looking at us, and we're like a toddler that's like trying to have control of this like household or something. And he's there like, why are you taking on all of this? You're not meant to. Like, this isn't your job, and you don't have the power, so why are you worrying about it? And all he wants is for you to like put it all down and just run to him. And that has been my experience with mental health, is learning to let go and run to him and find safety in him.
Thank you. Darren?
Can you read the end of the question just so I'm answering the right thing?
Yeah, so anxiety, OCD, never prayed that God would take it away. Actually afraid of what would happen if I was okay. Would I be safe? How can I start to bring God?
So I think like a lot, obviously these are generalized things we're talking about. So this is not every single person who struggles with anxiety and OCD. This is the reason. But I know for a lot of people, myself included, when we develop patterns of behavior we don't like, we haven't just like made it up because we have nothing better to do. It is filled a role in our life that at some point probably helped us survive something. It probably helped us get through a period of our life that was complicated or painful or overwhelming. And so it becomes like a best friend who understands you and knows you, So the idea that you're just going to send that away, even though you know it's destructive, just does not happen overnight. And that's where, like, I know I've been on the other side of that, where I've seen people act in ways where I'm like, well, just stop it. You know it's irrational. I know it's irrational. We both know it's harmful. But it's missing the role that that behavior is playing in that person's life. It's become like a mini savior. It understands me in the moments where nobody else understands me. And that's where I think the church is a bit behind. You know, when we have a understanding of mental health, we often get in a pulpit, tell people why it's bad and how they need to get rid of it. And they miss that this thing has helped for so long. And one of the most useful pieces of advice I was given was actually recognizing that it's, at one point, as destructive as it was, it played a positive role, but I don't need it anymore. It is now starting to destroy in a way that I cannot cope with anymore. And the fear of letting that go is Jesus going to be strong enough if I let this thing go that understands me? And that is scary for lots of people in a way that if you don't go through it, you will not understand. And that's where compassion and patience with people is huge. Because if we don't have that ourselves, although we all have a mini version of those things, because some people that's a job or a relationship or an income balance, that this is the thing that will help me get through life. And those moments when we're like, this is actually not helping. It's not just like I need to switch something in my head, it's I need to break off this relationship, and that is messy. It's messy when we do it with humans, it's especially messy when we're doing it with part of self.
Does anyone else want to take that on? Okay, it's kind of the opposite end in some ways. Someone talking about kind of dealing with maybe not feeling that you're in a terrible situation, but actually I find it hard to cry out to God because I'm not in a bad situation, but at the same time, I struggle to find much joy and fulfillment in my studies and relationships. The motivation to look to God isn't there because I'm fairly comfortable, and I almost feel that other people need His help much more than me. Any advice? Who feels?
I'd say one thing, well, two things. One is to pray a dangerous prayer and just ask God to show you more about yourself and more about Him. It is a dangerous prayer. Be ready for what comes. And the second thing is to keep your eye out for where you seem to react out of proportion to the situation, overreact if you like. And when you do, just take some time at some point during that day to talk to God about that and say, hey, what was going on there? Show me more. If you don't get anywhere, talk to a friend as well. Maybe someone who think you can help you get deeper. But those two things will open up a whole area which won't be easy, but will be full of life in the long run.
Ross.
And probably just to add that I think that sort of feeling that the question described is really, really typical of a certain age group, perhaps, I mean, this is a generalization, but perhaps people that have left university and have gone off into life and the working world, and as the sort of mundaneness of life and being involved in a local church without the buzz of the student world disappears, I think it's very easy to come to a place of feeling nothing much other than some sort of lingering apathy. And so you believe it, you think it's all true, but you don't have any passion, you don't know how to move forward from this place. And you want to be wholehearted, but that's just not how you experience it. And there's not necessarily an answer to that I can give you from up here, but almost notice that. I think as Bethan was saying about using your emotion as something that you lean into God with, that's true for the emotions such as fear and anxiety, but it's also true for those emotions where they sort of take less of you, like the sort of feelings of lackluster or apathy or sadness. In those places, say, Lord, where are you in the midst of this? What are you speaking to me in the midst of this sort of nothingy feeling? Because he is. He's right in there in the midst of it with you. But you just got to keep on looking. And I suppose just to encourage people to keep on being curious. We have an appetite for God that only grows as we get to know him more. So the more curious we are about this man Jesus, the more we sort of look at him, spend time with him, the more we'll realize that he is the treasure that we want to spend our life pursuing. But don't be surprised if it doesn't just come overnight. We've got a whole lifetime, for him to sort of redeem us and transform us. And I think we're so wired to want quick fixes and results now. And if we don't get them, we think we're doing something wrong, or God's changed his mind and he's gone off to sort out somebody else. But he's right there in the midst of whatever you are experiencing.
I've just finished therapy, and over the course of this, God has taken me through to the spacious place that Ros was talking about yesterday, and shown me some of the key lies I was believing. How do you continue to live from this place once you've got there? And I think a similar question, thinking about those factors we looked at the day before, yesterday morning, perpetuating protective factors. How do we think about those in a healthy way? What kind of practical steps we can take? So I guess there's two questions. One about, if we're on that journey, maybe we're beginning to feel that healing, but what are the best practical steps? I wonder if maybe each of you had suggestions about key sort of principles or disciplines that have helped you.
Shall I start?
Yeah, great.
Well, I think probably just to say that where we got to by the end of the talks yesterday was almost like that was a starting point. So from this place, we can begin to go on this journey of renewing our mind and looking at the things that have been tricky. And what happens next is all sorts of things. And I think the first thing for all of us is an increasing awareness of the lies that we are believing. Beth, on Friday night when we were having our conversation cafe, made the really helpful point that because of some of these issues are so internal and our sort of patterns of thought are so internal, we've got nothing to compare them to. And so for all you know, you can go around your life thinking this is totally normal to wake up every morning thinking, oh, another day. Or it's totally normal to wake up every morning and think, oh, yippee, I can't wait to face the day. Because we think that our experience of life is normal. And that's where communicating with other people and finding out what's going on inside is really helpful. But when we start by recognizing the thoughts or the patterns of thought, especially, that just aren't true, and I think then that's the time that we need to perhaps do some sort of work in methodically replacing those lies with truth. And I think there's a danger that you come to a weekend like this and you go away thinking, I've got to go and sort out every single aspect of my life right now. But that's just not the way it works. But there might be one lie that you've been believing about yourself that God shows you over these coming days and weeks. Ask him to show you what lies are your sort of habitual lies that you're believing about the way that life works. And then write that lie down so you can look at it in black and white. This is with a friend or in your small group or whatever. And then contrast that with the truth that we read about who you are in the scripture. And there's some really helpful books that help with this sort of thing. Like I found the Neil Anderson series, The Victory of the Darkness, was especially significant for me in my early 20s, when I suddenly realized that some of the things I'd believed about myself for so long just weren't true, and they weren't helping me to live in a way that was free. So write down these lies and put the truth next to them. In 2 Corinthians it says that we're told to take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. So take that thought, that lie, and say, is this truth? No, it's not. So therefore I'm going to reject this, and I'm going to fill my head with the truth that I am dearly loved, cherished, or whatever verses are helpful. But I think a huge part of this is getting those lies out of the darkness and into the light, because their power comes from the fact that they're unseen and they're hidden because of the shame of them. And something changes when we speak these lies out and we share them with other people, and we're able to see them more clearly, even just by doing that. So I think that would be my starting point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a case of practice, drawing on things that Darren said and Rosa said. My experience of coming to the end of therapy is you can, on the one hand, feel like, right, well, I've done all the treatment and that's it, and I should be fixed now. And I kind of feel like a bit rubbish, and I don't like the idea that life will be like this forever. And also, it's a bit like, oh, we've just opened a whole can of worms, and how am I meant to move forward from here? And that idea of core lies is really important. I think that what Darren was saying about having a mechanism that has served you, and now it's got to the point where it's no longer serving you, from that point you have to relearn how to live your whole life. And I think it's just about taking those thoughts captive, having an awareness of that lie, how you've arrived at it, how that lie has served you. So if you have a core lie that no one automatically likes you, or that no one is automatically on your side, that might have come about because you've had a lifetime of having to fight for needs that you are actually entitled to, like love and compassion. And now you're in a world where that's not true and you don't have to fight. Relearning that it's gonna take a long time, and life is gonna throw situations at you where you will realize that you haven't yet fully relearned it. And you just have to catch yourself when you are living in line with that lie that, for example, no one in this room likes me, I need to fight for their approval. Just challenging yourself to be like, well, actually, what does it look like to walk into this room and assume that I am valued and I am accepted? How does that change the way that I behave and feel about the way that people behave towards me? Ros reminded us yesterday about what Glenn Harrison said about strengthening neural pathways. And the more that you practice doing that, the easier it will be to slip into catching yourself in the lie and reminding yourself of the truth and living through that. But I guess my overall message would be practice and small steps and being patient with yourself. But it is a long journey.
Great. Just coming...
In terms of the spacious place, my experience is that it's a lifelong task of returning to it. I very rarely wake up in a spacious place, and that's not a comment on my bedroom. It's where my mind's at. And so expect it to be a lifelong work of returning to that spacious place. It's a wonderful place, but you don't naturally stay there. Effort is required to return there and to live there. And many of the rhythms that you'll have learned in the seminars can help that. That's just part of life.
Some of these are going to sound quite boring, but I'll go for them anyway. I think there's lots of disciplines we have in the Christian world which just become disciplines for no sake, and we've lost the reason why we do them. So I don't know about the idea of the practice of reading the Bible in the morning, but I know I get into periods of time where I read it like I'm reading the newspaper. It's like, oh, that's interesting. And then it might inform my day, as opposed to, like, I think for a long time I believed my mind was in neutral until something good or bad happened. But actually my mind is constantly processing things. You might not think that to speak to me, but that is what's happening with all of us. And this idea that I need to stop and reflect, how am I entering the world today? And what do I feed myself? Because I'm constantly feeding myself nonsense, and I spend a lot of time and energy allowing that and hold it as a priority. Like, Netflix is an example of how often I let that inform my worldview, but I don't see it like that. And I think we have to introduce tools so that would traditionally be called a quiet time. But as soon as you hear that phrase, you're like, I just need to sit, be quiet. Hopefully God will appear. And if he doesn't, I'll get on with my day. As opposed to how do I reorientate myself with reality? And the same at the end of the day, which is where I would struggle most. I would go to bed and I would have a sense of, and in that place you can feel quite isolated. But it's because it's not like I've been moving through life in neutral. So how do I actually have a practice of stopping and introducing something new and good? And then I think there's more riskier options, like that truth that Ros is saying of, like, when I speak this into the light, it becomes more true. This is my reality. And when it's met by another, I think that's a reflection of what God does when we're not rejected. But that's risky, because you're like, I've gone through all this stuff, and then I'm going to suddenly now inform other people. This is what I'm like. This is what I do. What will they do with that? And that's risky. So I think that starts with a couple of people you trust. So I was saying in our seminar earlier, one of the things for me used to be, it's still to a point, is hugely self-deprecating out of a place of a lack of self-worth. And when I realized that, like, I knew I was doing it, but I didn't realize the depths. A few people really close to me, they had the permission, and I had to give them the permission to call me out on that when they saw me do it. And be quite gently saying, you don't need to do that. And sometimes I was just doing it. Sometimes that's annoying because I'm just making a joke and you've ruined it. But a lot of the time it was coming from a defensive place, and having a couple of people really broke that down and actually opened me up to be like, oh man. And it's where I started to really understand the brother and sister language of the scriptures. Like, how are we family together? How do we do this journey and hold? And that takes going into the light. But as John says, when we go into the light, if we're not met in John by Christ or a reflection of Christ in another, we retreat back into the darkness at a pace that is so quick we will never want to come out again. And that's the default human nature that John seems to be unpacking there. We want to run back. So that's risky. It's risky, but I think it has to put flesh and bones in these ideas, because therapy is an idea we've worked out with a person, but the challenge is to take that into life. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're going to wrap up there. So, yes, Roz, you may.
Sorry, it's just that Pippa just pointed out a really good point, which I think is probably worth mentioning at this point before we go into the reflection and whatever's happening next. It's just that some of these lies that we've believed have been formed around hurts that we've experienced. And the issue of unforgiveness is a massive one when it comes to moving forward from the places that we find ourselves in. And forgiving somebody is incredibly difficult, and you might experience considerable resistance even to the idea. But it could be that there's people in this room where an unforgiveness or a bitterness towards somebody in your life is what is preventing you from really experiencing the love and the grace that God is inviting you to. So just sort of flag that up at this point before we go on to the next bit.
Thank you. Thanks so much to our panel. Thanks to everyone who's put questions, and thanks to everyone for listening. We hope that's been helpful. Thanks. Some of you, dealing with huge issues here, and sorry you couldn't answer all the questions, and some of you sent in particularly personal questions, and I think we just want to express that in addition to what we said, the NAVs absolutely support getting professional help, and there's people to talk to here about that in context to that.
Yeah, so any of us, Sue Watson, where's Sue? You can approach Sue. And we've got contacts, websites, phone numbers and so on, we can link you up with, so come and talk to us.
Brilliant. Well, give a big hand to our panel. Thanks very much. You guys can go.